Hello, friends, and welcome. Welcome to, I believe this is week 10. I cannot believe it. We're almost done together. And this is the last of the sessions that are devoted to the 7 categories on the MPS report. So we're going to today we're going to talk about administration, and then in the next 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about the world. So we'll be done with the MPS report. For those of you who have been tagging along on this journey, you'll know every single week for the last 6 weeks, we've been exploring that MPS report from 2019. Today's topic is administration and leadership. And so on the MPS report, I believe it just has leadership as the title. And then under the ministers' accountability, which I'll get to here in a second, so I'm about to repeat all this to you, the ministers are held accountable for administration and leadership. So they're two different things technically. So we'll be talking about them in two different things to a degree, but the heavy emphasis is going to be on administration, not so much on leadership. So there are 4 different videos, 4 different sections for today. I figured it was way too long to do in one big video, so I tried to break it up like I did in the initial sessions together. So I hope you have the Word document with you, the PDF, whatever you're reading from. Hope you have that up and ready to go as we deal with first a foundation for administration and leadership. So it begins by saying, the last category and common activity that the church often engages in is administration and leadership. I know that for many in our congregation have been thinking about this area of the church, especially in light of the recent approval of the new governance structure. Let's start as we normally do by exploring what we mean by administration and leadership. Technically, the MPS, the Ministry and Profile Search Report, does not contain an administration section, but rather includes the category leadership. The ethical standards and standards of practice for ministry and personnel, this is the document that the denomination uses to hold me as minister accountable for, includes both administration and leadership. And for those who are curious, that link is provided in that document. If you want to look at that PDF, it's available for all to see. The denomination separates administration and leadership because leadership is understood as something much, much broader. Leadership can be found in all 7 activities and categories of the church. I remember mispronounced these names, you know how I do with pronunciation. Scholars Mivens, Lucas, and McMahon define leadership as, quote, any attempt to accomplish something or change something. It's a very broad definition. This comes from their 2007 book, Exploring Leadership. It is not limited to just one person or a few. Anyone that is engaged in accomplishing or changing something is engaged in leadership in some capacity. So oftentimes we divide leadership between leaders and followers. And what they say is followers as well as leaders all participate in leadership, just in different ways, in different capacities. Leadership is purposeful, intentional, and actively participates in completing a task or changing something. My role as the sole religious leader is specific, but I am one of just many who engage in leadership at the church. Hence, the MPS acknowledges leadership over administration in the congregation, so leadership gets more focus. Administration, on the other hand, specifically refers to the operational tasks that support the existence of the church as an institution. This includes the running of the church office, the paying of bills, and the maintenance of the building, just to name the big ones. This includes, the administration of the church supports and enables the real purpose of the church, the ministries or the service of the church. The image of a house may be appropriate here. Administration is the foundation of a house. It's rarely seen and tended to by many, but it supports the entire structure that rests upon it. If you have a crack in your foundation, you have to re-pour that foundation, but it's only done by a few people, expert people. Your primary role at the church is to tend to the house that rests upon the foundation. Again, many of you have been thinking about administration due to our recent governance change. The Institute on Governance defines governance as addressing 3 key questions. How are decisions made? who has a voice in making these decisions, and ultimately, who is accountable. Governance is much broader than administration, but how administration is managed is determined by the governance structure. So to talk about administration, we got to talk about governance. The structure is the container for administration. Due to this connection, please allow me to provide a brief historical narrative from my perspective about the new governance structure. The governance structure has taken many forms throughout the history of Deer Lake United. In 1970, when Deer Lake amalgamated with St. Matthews and Douglas United, we had a board, and that had 4 committees. There was membership and communication, education, finance and property, and worship. P.S. They had 200 plus families, 4 committees. In addition to these other reporting bodies and groups, the board included presbytery, ATO. So I wanted to say the board minutes of those in the 1970s, who reported to the board besides these 4 committees. So technically there were other groups, like the presbytery rep, AOTS, which is the United Church's men's group, UCW, which is the United Church's women's group, and youth. From 1970 to 1988, thereabout, there was a board executive. In the 1970s, the board executive met a week prior to create the board agenda for the following week. Eventually, it was decided that the executive was just duplicating the board's efforts. In creating the agenda, the executive was already discussing the same matters that were then later discussed with a larger board the following week. The executive then decided to meet just prior to the board meeting to set the agenda at that time. Then, in the 1980s, it was decided that the executive could do some of the business of the board themselves. So the full board met every other month, while the board executive continued to meet every month. In 1975, the Education Committee was renamed Group Coordination with a hyphen in it for ordination. One proposed committee list in 1976, though it never came to be, included budget, communication and mechanics, events and fellowship, outreach to community, church services program, and the core committee. So 6 of them. And all I want to do in throwing that out there is there was active conversations throughout those early years of how do we want to govern ourselves? What committees do we need? What structure do we want? That type of thing. I guess maybe not what structure. We had a board structure. But what committees we need constantly was under negotiation. In 1978, the committees reduced from 4 to 3. They actually took one away. Worship and group coordination merged. In 1979, the committees again were restructured to worship and group coordination, membership and outreach, and finance and property, still only 3. The process for finding committee members was to elect the board of 21 members at the congregational meeting, the annual congregational meeting. Then the board members themselves would self-select, or somehow, I don't know, I wasn't there, but somehow those 21 people would then select which committee they would serve on, with 7 members per committee. The board meetings would open with a short devotional and correspondence, then break out to respective committees. They would then reconvene after a period to review what each committee had discussed and vote on each matter as a board, as an entire body. The 1980s brought more restructuring. 5 committees were established in 1981. So worship, property and finance, membership and communications, mission and outreach, and group coordination. 5 years later, in 1986, brought another committee change: worship, finance and property, Christian education and nurture, mission and stewardship, membership and communication, and personnel committee. In March of 1986, this was included in the board minutes, and it's a quote, and it's a quote that comes back. I'll talk about it here in a second. But the minister, who was David Martin at the time, gave a brief outline of the planning process, stressing the function of committees versus the function of the board. It is important that we realize that the congregation defines the overall purpose of the church. The board defines the goals, i.e., how to attain or fulfill the purpose, and the committees carry out the specific objectives in fulfilling the goals. There is, of course, fluidity between each of these. End quote. So for those of you who have been involved in the last decade will know that that was still a recurring question about what is the role of the board versus what are the role of the committees and that type of stuff. But this was back in '86, which I'm going to come back to how history still plays a part. Same old stuff with me, so we'll go back to that. The role of the board and the committees then is not just a recent issue, but one that's been carried over from generations prior. In 1988, the church had a significant governance change with the creation of session. This was a trend in the United Church as a whole, which comes from our Presbyterian roots. The session included mission and stewardship, membership and communication, worship, and Christian education and nurture. The board retained property and finance, renamed stewards, and personnel. In essence, session handled the ministries of the church and spiritual matters, while the board handled the business side, the finances, staff, etc. Those on session were also on the board. Session met monthly on the second Tuesday from 7:30 to 9:30 p.m. The stewards met monthly on the third Tuesday, and then the board met every 3 months on the fourth Tuesday. This structure lasted 10 years until 1998. The meeting dates may not have been consistent for those 10 years, but session and the board existed for 10 years. At some point between 1988 to 1991, the trustees were established as a committee of the board. The session involved a decade of existence. The session evolved in its decade of existence as well. For example, in 1993, it included Christian education, worship, mission, fellowship, pastoral care, and music. The following year, in '94, it expanded even further. Christian education, including youth, Sunday school, and nursery, worship, mission, music, pastoral care, and liturgical arts. 2 years later, 1996, it expanded even further. Music, church school, membership, worship, communion, lay readers, nursery, social events, youth groups, baptisms, outreach, and pastoral care. In 1998, the session was officially removed or dissolved. The new committees of the board included communication, Christian education, fellowship, pastoral care, presbytery, outreach, records, stewards, finance, worship, ministry and personnel, MMP, and UCW. A board executive existed, but I'm unclear of its role. Eventually, and the date's unknown, the executive does dissolve, so then it just has a board. As with the previous governance models, all the committee members were board members. One difference, I think, from previous method, I'm open to being corrected if I'm wrong about this, so this is an assumption I'm making based on what I've read, is that people agreed to be on committees first and thereby were on the board. So whenever people were going out, so in the 70s, they would go out and find board members, and then the board members, by virtue of being on the board, were on committees. Instead, I think the approach was, we have these committees, we need people to be on these committees, and then if you're on those committees, then you just happen to also be on the board. So it flips it. In the previous models, people were voted onto board first, then the first board meeting of their term selected a committee. This meant that instead of limiting the board to just 21 people or so, the board had the potential to increase exponentially dependent on the number of committee members, right? So that's what changes with the board. The board composition is first contained, and then with the focus on the committees first, the board can just explode, which is what it did. In 1998, very little has changed with the committees. The committees have been refined over the years. For example, in 1999, the committees included ministerial, worship, UCW, Christian ed, communications, finance, membership, pastoral care, ministry and personnel, outreach, presbytery, stewardship, and trustees. In 2012, the committees list, which really from 2012, it's been pretty standard, or pretty static. Christian ed, communications, finance, ministry and personnel, outreach, pastoral care, stewards, trustees, worship, and library, photographs, and records. Some of these committees have changed, specifically library, depending on individuals who are willing to serve on them, rather than the board ensuring that people were on them. Unlike the previous decades, the governance structure stabilized in the 2000s until about 2018 when Reverend Scott Swanson arrived. Deer Lake United entered interim ministry, which was a sacred time for the congregation to take a good look at itself in the mirror. At this time, it was determined that the governance structure was burdensome and needed revision. This is reflected in the Ministry Profile Search Mps Report from 2019. This was also part of the interim report, the final one for the congregation. So, the Mps report reads, we are doing the following in leadership. Remember, there's no administration, just leadership. Integration of Circle Way concepts into our meetings, making changes in our governance model following a board retreat, sending individuals to the art of hosting, plans to send people to more leadership events in early 2019, working to empower committees to make decisions within their mandate, one-time worship on active witnessing, board retreat to develop a behavioral covenant. We have a specific goal related to leadership as follows: to empower our committees and volunteers to do the work that they have been tasked with and develop strong leadership values/skills. Reverend Scott Swanson, as referenced in the Mps report, worked with the congregation to reestablish a board executive. So it talked about how we were recently, after a board retreat, restructured. It created a board, it reestablished the board executive. This time the executive would handle the business of the church, while the full board meetings were focused on education and worship. The executive met bi-monthly, with the full board meetings meeting on the off months. And I've been told off record that it was very confusing to know which one was full and which one was executive, because it would change so frequently. When COVID hit, it was decided to revert back to just full board meetings because it was viewed that communication between the vast amounts of people was essential, and the weight of the decisions being made merited everyone's voice. When I came in 2020, it was clear that further attention was needed regarding governance. Problems emerged around who does what and burdensome processes that didn't need to be so complicated. Building on several years of identifying shortcomings in the present governance structure of the board, the board struck a governance task force in September of 2020 to review the current structure as well as the policies of the church. The task force independently, aka not with me leading, I was chair, but they independently came to this, chose to explore policy governance, which is a growing trend within the United Church. They believed that the first step to helping relieve some burden from the congregation was to immediately reduce the board from all the committee chairs, and the members to just the committee chairs. This reduction of the board was passed by the congregation in February 2021. In November of 2021, the congregation approved moving to a form of policy governance to be implemented in February of 2022. The Mps report speaks to the transitionary phase that the church has been in for several years. I shared the 1986 quote from the board minutes above, specifically because of this Mps goal. I also hope that you noticed how frequently the governance changed prior to 1998. Some may see this as troublesome, but my interpretation is quite different. I saw a people who were wrestling with, how are we going to do this thing called church in the best way possible? Always trying to mix it up and change things to address the present needs of the church. And I think there's a real strength to that adaptability or that response to the moment. As we move to a completely different governance structure, one that is unlike anything done before at Deer Lake United, it will be important for us to be told a few key pieces to keep in mind if we're going to find success in moving in this direction. And that's what follows in the sections that follow this. So, reflection questions. So first, what's your role of leading at Deer Lake United? How do you participate in leadership, either as a leader or as a follower? What does leadership look like for you at Deer Lake United? The second question, how much of this governance history do you remember? So I started in the 1970s and kind of walked you through it year by year. There are some things I left out for time's sake, just to keep it brief. What's missing from this narrative about how the governance structure has changed over the years? And lastly, why do you think the governance structure hasn't significantly changed since 1998? What are the implications or consequences of this stability, for better or for worse? I really wanted to use a neutral word but I felt like there wasn't a neutral word. So static, stability, whatever we want to call this, frozen in time, but all those kind of have connotations for positive, for negative. So I used the word stability because I wanted to err on positive, but what was the consequence of this flatness or this frozenness, this stability, for better or for worse? All right, friends, I'm going to move on to the second video, which I believe is about priorities and values.